Hi, I'm Matthias, and this is the British Revolver breech-loading Enfield Mark I interchangeable, the first wheel gun made by the Royal Small Arms Factory Enfield, and one it seems that they'd rather you forget about. Too bad for them that I'm here to shove this into the lightbox. Weighing in at 2½ pounds and with an overall length of 11½ inches, this is an old world black powder revolver. We have 6 cartridges, these being the Enfield Mark II or III, which are not technically a .476, more on that in a moment. They are loaded singularly through the side gate, but they're ejected in a very dramatic fashion. Don't forget that most of today's episode is brought to you by viewers like yourself, who have chosen to support the project for as low as $1 a month over at Patreon or Utreon. Now, some of this episode is also made possible by support from Ballistol. Actually, I guess that kind of works 2 ways, because yes, they're now a sponsor, but they have also been a long-standing integral product to our preservation and safe operation of these historical pieces. Ballistol has been our go-to universal oil for cleaning, lubricating, and safely storing our old guns. Thanks to its unique formulation, Ballistol is best used on the metal parts of your gun. Just spray it on and wipe off the excess, leaving a thin protective residue. While I wouldn't soak it into the wood, it doesn't do any harm when oversprayed. Just again, make sure to wipe off that extra. Now, we have used this stuff for years. This is still an old can, not one that I was given recently, and I've yet to have a problem or really even a complaint. Grab some for yourself and stay tuned, as I'll soon be showing you a number of additional uses that you can find for this particular product other than just spray and wipe, but baby steps, right? Now, the story of the British Revolver is nowhere near as linear as a humble history merchant like myself would have hoped for, and today's topic, the Enfield, represents perhaps the most bizarre chapter of the entire epic. I am frankly gobsmacked that no one has written a dedicated book on this particular firearm. In my attempt to produce this episode, I found that I had to call on a wide variety of resources. Special thanks must therefore go to my friend Jonathan Ferguson and his co-workers at the Royal Armories. I frankly inundated them with questions and calls for favors in my effort to unpack this mess. I've also heard he may have 1 or 2 prototypes on hand and wouldn't be surprised to see a video on this topic very soon, or perhaps even before this video, so make sure you're subscribed to his channel. Also, special thanks needs to go out to Colonel Keith Gibson over at VMI, and to Mike Reves over at the Pennsylvania Antique Gun Collectors Association. Both of them were very helpful in locating some very specific articles that helped clear up just a little bit more of this story. Now, in order to explain any of this convoluted story, we'll have to do a little bit of background work. The British Army revolver was born out of a series of fits and spurts, beginning with the Crimean War. This conflict, fought from 1853 to 1856, saw Russia defeated by the Allied forces of the Ottoman Empire, France, what would become Italy, and of course, the United Kingdom. At the time, the British standard sidearm was a single-shot percussion pistol offered in minor variations depending on the service. However, the war meant that supplies of said pistols ran just a bit thin. In response, the Army begrudgingly purchased the Colt single-action percussion revolver, which frankly they barely used, and ditched as soon as they could. In 1856, they would trial some Adams-derived double-action percussion revolvers. These also failed to impress, and the single-shot pistol was again chosen for service. Now, in the era of muzzle loading and percussion caps, this was not an unusual decision. Many countries resisted mass adoption of the early, complicated, and frankly fragile revolvers that were available. But the technology kept on improving. Breech-loading, metallic cartridges were introduced to the market just ahead of the American Civil War, which for many served to reinforce the worth of the repeating pistol, and for everyone guaranteed the superiority of breech-loading. For years afterwards, various nations would begin experiments with their own breech-loading multi-shot pistols. The Royal Navy would be among the early adopters, taking in the Adams Mark I revolver of 1868, which used a centerfire 450 Boxer cartridge. Austria-Hungary would adopt the Gasser in 1870. Sweden purchased a centerfire modification of the Luffa Show in 1871. Russia took up the Smith & Wesson top break that same year, and Switzerland would be the first to adopt the Chamelot Delvin in 1872, albeit as rimfire. And in that same year, Prince George, serving as the commander-in-chief of the forces, became concerned with the revolver question. He had noticed complaints stacking up from the Lancers about the obsolescence of the single-shot pistol, and in June of 1872 requested the selection of a new service sidearm which would accommodate breech-loading cartridges. In October, the superintendent of the Royal Small Arms Factory Enfield, then Lieutenant Colonel George Henry John Alexander Fraser, the man with 4 first names, recommended a breech-loading revolver and submitted 2 example patterns. Prince George, however, did not like wheel guns and rejected both. Several other designs would be kicked around before the matter was frankly abandoned for several more years. All the while, more and more of the world began adopting revolvers. The Royal Navy improved their Adams revolver in 1872. Following that, France converted the Chamelot to centerfire and adopted it themselves. The Dutch listened to Berhanzius, and the US Colt Single-Action Army emerged. This was all in 1873 now. All of these guns, of course, brought on more complaints about the obsolete Lancer pistols, and in January of 1874, the ball would be kicked once again. Adjutant General Richard Airy would again request a new sidearm for the cavalry be properly explored. In February, an improved version of the Adams revolver was submitted. Available notes do not reveal what was changed, except that apparently it added an extra pound to the weapon. This was, of course, rejected. Also in February, the Director of Artillery proposed the cavalry carbine be replaced with a revolver, specifically one of Tranter's make with an 8-inch long barrel. Given the time frame, this was likely one of the 1868 pattern weapons that we see here, although not with an 8-inch barrel. While the carbine replacement was rejected, the Lancer question remained open and on the table. So in June of 1874, Fraser submitted 2 versions of the long-barreled Tranter revolvers alongside another updated Adams. This was presumably the then current Mark III Adams, which sadly failed to impress the Army at this time. Instead, it was a final arm submitted by Fraser that grabbed the Army's attention. This was a double-barreled pistol submitted by Wilkinson Sword. Unfortunately, the details of this firearm are a complete mystery to me. I have a suspicion that the pistol was a precursor to the later Lancaster 2-barrel, but I've been unable to confirm this. Not only are they separated by a fair few years, the original pistol is actually supposedly not in a handgun cartridge. I have at least one of my sources claiming the government was playing with a gun chambered in .450 Martini. That sounds insane to me, but I have also found a personal account of an officer handling a 2-shot Wilkinson pistol that he says was in .577 Snyder, which he clearly speculates on the possibility of ordering one in Martini instead. Apparently, the 2 shots impressed the Army enough to warrant purchasing 25 for trials with the Lancers in October of 1874. Colt's British agent von Alpen apparently caught word of these trials, as he informed his employer that a 2-chambered pistol was under serious study by the British War Office in May of 1875. Trials dragged on for some time, as the reports wouldn't be received until April of 1877. The pistols were found to be generally unfavorable. I can't imagine why they didn't like shooting .450 Martini out of a handgun. Now, while all that was going on back in January, the War Office was approached by Birmingham gunmaker Walter Scott. Now, I'm going to save all of you a lot of time and explain something right up front. Walter Scott was offering a revolver under a British patent that was actually held by a man named Amadee Thornton de Muncey, who himself was supposed to be serving as an agent for a Belgian gunsmith by the name of Jean Warnant, although apparently there was some acrimony to come in that relationship. De Muncey styled himself as a baron, but I've been unable to back up that claim. What little I can dig up about him is that he appeared to like holding patents for other people in foreign lands, sort of a professional middleman. Presently, de Muncey held British Patent 3206 of 1876, which was, again, clearly a British filing of a Belgian patent from 1875, originally from Jean-Joseph Warnant. Born in Chartres, Belgium, February 28, 1845, Jean's biographical data is surprisingly scant. All we really know is that at some point he made his way to Liège and began working as a gunsmith, and apparently a gun designer. Core to his patent today was an extremely simple lockwork, providing single and double action operation and an automatically rebounding hammer. This was done with just 4 component parts: the hammer, the trigger, the mainspring, and the hand. A sample of the Warrant revolver was submitted to the War Office in late January of 1877. This must have elicited some interest because a request for pricing came to Scott in March. In April, 6 were purchased at a price of 42 shillings each. 2 of these were expected to be like the patent model already submitted, but the remaining 4 were simplified by request, ditching Warrant's patented side plate latch. The resulting pistol was probably similar to this, another Warrant submitted to the Norwegian trials about the same time. Simple and rugged, it should have impressed. Unfortunately, it seems the British examples were poorly constructed. The pistols were returned as unacceptable and had to be reworked by Scott, who blamed the quality issues on their manufacturer in Liège. I'm unsure who that was, by the way, in Liège making the guns. These were then resubmitted and subjected to the usual endurance testing. Unfortunately, the Warrants were found to work poorly. Their cartridges lacked penetration, although I'm fairly sure they were just using the Service Adams round. More importantly, however, they suffered from frequent misfires. The new superintendent of the Royal Small Arms Factory Enfield, then Colonel Frederick Close, believed that the malfunction could be resolved, and that the design had merit. He began attempts at modification. However, at the moment, the design had no merit over the existing naval Adams. Now, around this time, Colt would also submit their single-action army for British inspection, but the War Office returned it unfired. Why would a modern revolver lack a double-action trigger? Smart enough to know it needs to be a DA, and yet still issuing muzzle-loading percussion pistols, the revolver matter was coming to a head. It was time to at least make a stopgap decision. So, in November of 1877, the Adams would receive approval. It would be issued to staff sergeants and trumpeters of the cavalry and to the Lancer regiments. This would be expanded to include the Adams Mark III in April of 1878. Now, we know from other episodes of this particular show that several competing designs would actually emerge on the British market in 1878. The Colt and the Tranter double-action revolvers of, well, 1878, both of which attempted to compete for British Army attention. Strangely, both would fail and both would succeed. Thanks to a Russian victory in the Russo-Turkish War fought in 1877 and 1878, Britain found itself growing concerned about Russian expansion into the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans agreed to British administration of Cyprus, putting their government and troops closer to the potential action. In addition, Britain saw fit to mobilize more troops into Malta, likely as a flexible staging area in case of further conflict. Around this time, the infantry finally accepted the revolver as well, creating an incredible demand on the Adams, who had no hope of keeping up production. So the Army bought up commercial options, the Colt 1878, which only sold 165 units, the Tranter 1868 with perhaps 230 purchased, and the big winner, the Tranter 1878 with an order for 2,000 units that was subsequently reduced to just 1,500. We of course have episodes on all of these. While those purchases were being made, Walter Scott again approached the Army, explaining the Warrant patent revolvers were now being made in Britain of superior quality. This was apparently met with rejection. That same month, de Muncey filed a provisional patent for an addition to a revolver lockwork. Because the provisional patent was abandoned and no drawings were submitted, I'm actually unsure of just what he had in mind exactly. However, it's a fair bet that it had to do with the misfire issue, and this is when the real mystery kind of starts. Recall, Superintendent Close believed the Warrant action could be modified to avoid misfires. It's likely he charged one Mr. Thomas Perry, manager at RSAF Enfield, to take on the project. Thornton de Muncey apparently visited Enfield regularly, and in later documents it is said that he consulted with Mr. Perry on this same problem. The story goes that Perry invented the notion of adding a 5th part to the lockwork, showing the concept to de Muncey, who supposedly then took it to, well, of all people, William Tranter. Okay, this kind of makes sense. Tranter could produce an improved lockwork so that de Muncey could keep pushing for trials of an improved pistol. Tranter made his own interpretation of the Perry modification, but did not patent the resulting design. Okay, here's where it gets worse. De Muncey was now working with Michael Kaufmann, a gunsmith who split his time between Liège and Birmingham. Kaufmann would, as far as I can tell, be the first to actually get a patent on the improved lockwork. This would be a Belgian patent showing up in October 15th and being further amended on the 31st. These covered a pivoting arm sharing the hammer's axis pin, acting as a transfer bar between the mainspring and the hand. I'll be honest, I don't understand how this would prevent misfires, but I could see it reducing friction, lightening the trigger, and making the mainspring simpler to construct. The same would be patented under Kaufmann's name in England in December of 1878. Okay, de Muncey now retires from our story, having sold or otherwise entrusted his patent interest to Kaufmann, who, before even receiving his Belgian patent, wrote to the War Office in Britain offering the improved revolver, carefully made supposedly by William Tranter. This was accepted and apparently trialed, but it seems Warnant and Kaufmann's revolver was missing a key feature of interest. While the broad majority of Martial revolvers to this point had been ruggedly built gate-loading designs, meant to feed or eject just one round at a time, there was some growing demand for something that could be reloaded faster. The best known of these options at that time was the Smith & Wesson No. 3 top break simultaneous extracting revolver, which, while popular with Russia and a few others, was still seen as a fairly fragile system. Sometime around 1876, Britain starts to see a series of commercial top-break revolvers built on the patents of Belgian gunsmith Philippe Connet. To the user, these work just like the Smith & Wesson and begin to capture market attention. The expectation for a modern revolver has now expanded. If you're going to displace the Adams, doing so for just a simpler lockwork probably isn't enough. The only problem is that your average top break left a lot of pricey parts out in the wind. As a matter of fact, this is the market leader at the time, the Connet, so let's just take a look real quick. Alright, I have a Belgian-made actual Philippe Connet revolver that has unfortunately seen better days, but it's all here and it's working mechanically, and it can certainly serve as an aid for us today, because this is really the first of an era in the British market. This is a revolver that is designed as a simultaneous eject, rapid loading, double action handgun. And they were being marketed in 450 Adams, and later they'd be marketed in the 476 quote-unquote cartridge, and then on into 455 Webley even, because this was a popular brand for a while. Now, interestingly about this gun is I've never found the original patent for this particular configuration, especially in Britain. I've seen what is the sort of origin patent for protecting this lockwork in Belgium, but in Britain it seems like the gloves somehow were off, and everybody seemed to be importing these under various names and under brand identities, and even this was cloned by Webley. But the original design goes back to Connet. Now, being the very early emergent design, but the most popular to come in Britain for a while, what was it that they were seeing about this that was so remarkable? Well, first of all, it has a single boom and double action lockwork. In this case, this is actually a Fanyu style lockwork in here, but I've seen them with Tranter lockworks and others. The lockwork is actually the most variable thing in these. What's the same in all of them is the way that you unlock the cylinder. And that would be with a pair of tilting blocks. So if I push on these guys, we get a teeter-totter effect, and there's two pins, locking pins, that fit into holes at the top of the breech. With them removed, we separate what is the frame of the gun from this barrel assembly, and then we can tip the gun open. Now at this angle, you're not going to see everything, but from the user perspective, you can see that you have all 6 chambers visible, and it's a little bit odd because it's coming straight at you, but the ejector is engaging. Just to see that from the side, we'll push both. The ejector starts activating. It's going to kick everything out until it goes over center. Then we snap back flush so that you can quickly load your 6 rounds. This ejection system is really inherited and simplified from the Smith & Wesson. We'll actually talk more about how that happened in another episode, but you get the idea. We can rapidly access all 6 of the chambers, kick out all of our spent cases, and boom, reload the gun. This is good technology. However, it was at the time considered to be fairly complicated and fragile. Not just because we have to have a spring and tab in here. By this point, this is actually getting pretty simple compared to the Smith & Wesson down in there. The bigger problem is that the central arbor is unsupported through this whole operation. It can become distorted and bent. There's also a little bit of a utility issue in that the cylinder has to be supported just at the front of this arbor, and it does have to be retained in such a way. We have to have a friction sprag. We have to have all these things that go into a revolver, which means if I try to free spin this, even as old as it is, you notice we're not just gliding. It's only rolling over maybe once and coming to a stop at best. This is a method that has a fair bit of drag in it. And then on top of it all, when you go to pop this guy open, your ejector is frankly fairly fragile, and it's out in the wind. It's not uncommon to find early ejector style pistols like this, or even later top breaks on in the 1920s in the US as they were popular. Those guns often have chips or even broken off spurs from the star. You know, the rods will get weak, this whole thing gets loose, and when this gets loose, since the teeth for the hand are on the star, the ejector star, well, that ruins your timing. So this is a system that frankly puts some of the heart of the mechanism literally out in the wind, and therefore makes it very vulnerable to damage in field service conditions, or more frankly, from being putzed around with by officers and various infantry that might be using it. Now here's another system that was known to the British at the time. This is an 1868 Galland, although this one's probably a little later than that because it has all the upgrades and improvements, but the basic mechanism is the same, which is that if we want to unload or load this particular revolver, we have to pull back on this latch and then flip the trigger guard all the way forward, at which point our cylinder actually moves forward with the barrel assembly until we reach a, let's say, a stop point in which the extractor plate is held firm while the cylinder continues forward on its own. In this method, the extraction now happens into this sort of opening here, and if we want to reload the gun, we can sort of bring it back, put the plate forward as we're putting in our first round, and we can load and roll and load and roll, and we have all this access that we can deal with. Let me get you a better angle on this. So if we're thinking about loading the gun, we open up the barrel, and then in this case, I'm actually pulling everything to the rear so I can stay in the camera, but that is how you would be able to access. So left or right-handed, no big deal. You can reach in there, and then at full extraction, boom, everything's coming out. Now, the Galland has a very thick and sturdy arbor, and when it's closed up, it's supported at both ends completely. There is a downside, however, which is that when open, the arbor is the only thing tying the two halves of the gun together. And when closed, you're really just holding this gun together with the arbor and sort of this latch, but even that's questionable at best because the latch is actually pushing a lot of force down, you guessed it, the arbor this way to keep itself over center on this sort of toggle mechanism. That means that the base of the arbor, which is threaded and then screwed into the frame, is taking all of the force of this gun, which means you are very limited on how powerful of a cartridge you can use. So, yeah, is it closed up a little bit better than the Smith & Wesson style or the Kone style? Sure, but it's a lot weaker mechanically. Now, these were likely the same concerns held by the Army officials because they seemed to be rather excited by the submission of a new option by one Owen Jones, who has somehow managed to completely dodge any of the usual means by which I can find a birth or even a death date for an inventor. While I lack proof, it does appear that he was a British subject, and some say that he actually came from Wales, who traveled to Philadelphia in the United States in order to work for the Deringer Rifle and Pistol Works. Home of the old holdout pistol, working for Deringer put Jones on the path of compact pistols, specifically in his case, revolvers. In 1874, he would file patent for a wildly unique concept, a two-barreled revolver with a spare cylinder in the grip. This allowed the user to select for either of two cartridges, presumably 22 and 32 caliber in practice. Particular to our episode, in 1876, he filed for and received both a US and British patent for his own unique extraction system for revolving firearms. His design had the benefit of using a fairly simple and strong construction, not requiring a central spring in the cylinder, And unlike the Glon, the barrel is attached to the frame by 2 points when locked, and the arbor is essentially a floated component. It's worth noting the latch in this system was copied from the Full and Weeks top brake, a firearm already in production at the Deringer works. In 1877, Jones would further improve his patent with the addition of a more positive ratchet system, and more notably, by timing it to provide for selective extraction, meaning the cylinder moved forward just enough for a spent case to fall free, but the bullet of a loaded case would keep the still ready cartridge in place. Now, the initial Owen Jones patents had a bit of a strange fault. You see, the hand would rotate the extractor plate, which is actually still true of the gun here. That's not the weird part. What's odd is the plate itself wasn't keyed to the cylinder, which means that the extractor plate only rotated the cylinder when the firearm was loaded with either a live or spent case. I mean, I guess it makes sense, but I could see a lot of people thinking that their gun was broken because they'd pull the trigger and the cylinder wouldn't rotate if it was empty. Regardless, the pistol would be improved further. Filing in January of 1878, Owen Jones had clearly been putting in a lot of work on this design, now fleshed out into a full-sized Army-style single-action revolver. The extraction principle was largely the same. Notably, this example sports a hollow tube under the barrel. This was meant to house a toolkit of sorts. We can see it somewhat better in his more detailed British patent, which was filed in February. Here you can see the segmented cleaning rod tucked away in the tube. The cap has an attached screwdriver. On this drawing, the barrel is locked in something of a Koné derivative fashion. However, sheet 3 still shows what will become a familiar spring-loaded latch, still kind of coming from the Full and Weeks camp. It's also interesting to note that he provided a lever at the bottom of the frame that could be used to further extend the cylinder, thereby extracting even loaded cases quickly if desired. Now, the February filing date of that British patent paints a lovely picture because I have access to some notes that claim Owen Jones paid a call on the War Office and offered up an example of his pistol at about that time. The Director of Artillery, however, was absent, and so he moved on to Paris. Presumably, we'll actually find another patent of his there for February or March. It would take until November of 1878 for his revolver to be demonstrated at Enfield properly. The pistol described matches the British patent, and apparently garnered some attention from those present. In the meantime, it appears that the revolver question had suddenly become much more pressing. I honestly wish I knew why. My suspicion is that somewhere unbeknownst to us, some matter of financing or adoption was resolved, because things start flowing. But the domestic manufacture of revolvers for military service was, from the government perspective so far, a bit of a disaster. Both the Adams revolver and the Tranter hadn't really been all that interchangeable. They were frankly best when manufactured in large batches, the usual Birmingham way. However, what the government needed was the ability to produce on demand, whether a lot or a little. This boom or bust schedule frankly destabilized the domestic market and could throw manufacturers out of business before a third wave of purchases might be made. Now, those of us deep in the future know that this whole notion would be inverted years later. As it turns out, a strong commercial market is better than a singular government factory, trying to hire, retrain, and fire over and over and over again. But at that time, consolidation of production and guaranteeing both actual interchangeability of parts and that the factory lines would remain available until such time as the model was entirely replaced was a bigger deal to the British Army. So it seems the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield was given the go-ahead to begin tooling up for their own government-produced revolver. On January 30th of 1879, Owen Jones was asked to supply 2 different samples of his revolver as quickly as possible. For this, he was paid £10 a piece. That was big cash at the time. By the middle of February, the matter of ammunition was also being brought up. The .450 Adams cartridge had earned a rather poor reputation for failing to stop determined threats. That's likely because, despite being a .45 caliber projectile, it was backed by a fairly light powder charge in a short case. This was due to it being born out of a cartridge conversion era. Colt's agent von Alpen notes in his March 4th letter that the Adams was clearly on the way out, and that the War Office was sampling all of the self-extracting revolvers that it could lay hands on. And from here, The story actually goes a little bit dark. Direct commentary on Enfield's decisions are almost non-existent as far as I can find. Tranter, Kaufman, and Warren all note that the War Office goes from amiable and mostly available up to roughly the middle of 1879 to shuttered and silent, especially in 1880. I'm not giving much away at this point when I tell you they opted to combine the Kaufman-modified Warnant lockwork with the Owen Jones selective extraction system. However, thanks again to Jonathan, we have some clear evidence that they were tinkering with other ejection methods at that time. Here is what seems to be a Warnant system tied to a spear lay ejector. Oh, what could have been. Now, in this otherwise dark and hazy period, there is a bit of an odd clue as to what might actually be going on. Sources say that of all the inventors involved, Owen Jones, the one I have so little data for, seemed to keep up the best rapport with Enfield. More importantly, I am told there are extant low serial number examples of Owen Jones revolvers marked with American-style patent dates using the Warnant lockwork. This implies that he may have been directly involved in the trialing of what would become the Enfield Revolver, introducing or eliminating key features along the way. Regardless of how, by October of 1879, the Warnant and Jones mechanisms were successfully wedded. The matter must have been serious because at about the same time, Von Oppen told Colt that the new pattern service revolver had actually already been sealed. This was a bit premature though. The Royal Navy, by the way, had been paying close attention to the potential new service revolver and was happy to begin trials with it. In January of 1880, these were held at the Naval Shore Establishment HMS Excellent. The ammunition used had apparently been developed back in August of 1879 and was still in trials itself. This would be the Enfield Mark I cartridge, which is frankly quite mysterious as well. The data we're presenting here represents our best guess, as the cartridge never saw general issue. It's suspected that this may have still used the two-piece case construction of the previous Adams cartridge, an unfortunate design that led to rims tearing off the case in extractor revolvers. The new Enfield Trials revolver apparently performed quite well, though it was just competing against the existing Adams in 450. Thanks to the new cartridge, it outshot its precursor, especially out to ranges past 200 yards, where it was noticeably flatter. Although 200 yards does seem a bit extreme for a pistol. Also, in the Enfield's favor, the Warnant Kaufman lockwork was found to be more reliable and less likely to get out of order than the old Adams. There were, however, some complaints. The grip was not considered suitable, thanks to a tendency to increase jump. The shape would be changed for the final model. The gun was susceptible to rapid fouling, not just because of black powder in general, but because the Trials model had rifled chamber mouths. These clogged up rapidly and made rotation more difficult. The chamber rifling would be eliminated. And finally, it was noted that on extraction, the lower case in the 6 o'clock position would regularly hang up, requiring the user to either tip the revolver or rotate the cylinder to clear the case. This minor problem was actually never rectified. With the official report dropping on February 6th of 1880, RSAF Enfield was able to forward an improved pattern on the 1st of March. This was approved by the Navy on the 24th. The Army would follow in April, getting approval from the Commander-in-Chief. But the Secretary of State didn't sign off until August, which is when, well, actually this was finally sealed as the Revolver Breech Loading Enfield Mark I Interchangeable. A pattern cleaning rod was approved in September, but it appears that the ammunition was not forthcoming, so temporarily, retroactive use of the 450 Adams cartridge was also given the go-ahead until the matter could be resolved. These announcements made the list of changes released with the Army circulars of November of 1880. Okay, we finally have our pistol today, so let's just get a closer look at what the heck they did. Alright gang, we have a very large military revolver from 1880, the Enfield Mark I. And if you can't tell, this is a metal construction with just a little bit of wood grip down here. Oh, it's checkered. That's nice. And before we get into the details of what makes this unique, let's just go over the basics for someone that's picking it up and using it right away. We have a single action, so I cock that hammer back, and I'm going to tell you, the hammer arc is very awkward. It feels short, and it feels like I'm really struggling to get over center. But we have single action, so we cock the hammer back, pull the trigger, and she drops. We also have double action operation where I'm going to pull that trigger, the hammer's going to come back on its own. I'm going to ease it so that it won't beat up this old beauty. And then, watch the hammer. Ooh, automatic rebound. You know, for 1880, that's already a very advanced feature, so we're well modern just off of that alone. But we're going to see more in just a second. Sticking with ergos, we have a very deep knuckle right at the back of this guy. This is honestly just a little bit too high for what it is, but at least it's there to help with the double action pull. This is what a lot of people would call a time of saw handle grip. If we bring her on forward, you know what? I'm not sure. Hold on, let me go to the front sight. So we have a very prominent and very thin front sight that should be fairly good for fine sighting and fine accuracy on range. However, it's been paired with not so much of a rear sight as a long, narrow gutter, and it is extremely shallow in there. I'll have to show you a picture of this later on, but very finely sighted, very hard to see in operation. Now, a feature that was new on this pistol, but we'll see in future models, are these holster guides. So these two triangles were set up such to prevent the front of the cylinder from wearing on the leather of the holster. This spread it out a little bit better. It also probably prevented, let's say, leather tears or little tufts of what would be inside the holster from getting into the front of these chambers and therefore potentially tying up the action in an emergency. It's a fairly smart design. On the Mark I, these are kind of fluted at the top especially, I believe just to reduce weight. If you flip it over, they are solid though. Now, loading on this revolver comes from the side gate, so we'll flip that open and we would individually load our 6 rounds. I'm gonna actually load a mix of dummies and empty cases in just a second, but before we do that, let's look at these notches on the cylinder. Don't forget, every cut on a firearm of this age has a purpose. None of these are what you would consider decorative. So what's going on? Well, the fluting is reducing the weight of the gun overall without compromising the strength of the cylinder, or at least not so much that it matters. These little guys, these triangles, are for our stop. That we'll see in our animation a lot better. But these little notches, these sort of secondary triangles, well, they're interacting with the gate just like on the Colt 1878. Now, this one's a little bit worn out, so it's very hard to see the motion, but essentially, when we operate this gun and it comes back around, if we release the trigger, these little notches butt up against this extension. See this little extension off the front of the gate? That catches in there and therefore prevents counter rotation when the trigger is released, because in theory, you can end up with an off-balance gun. You know, you have 6 rounds, you fire 3, now you have 3 empties on this side, 3 full on the other side. It's gonna wanna counter rotate when you release the trigger and therefore slack the hand that is up against the ratchet teeth in there. This guy is to prevent that. On this particular gun, it's worn down almost completely so that it actually is hiding a little bit under there, but there is a stop under there. It's just enough to have prevented a malfunction on range, although it probably is due for a little repair. Let me see if I can get you an angle where you can see it working. The motion is going to be very minor, but you're going to watch this crack right here. We're going to see that gate move ever so slightly due to the cylinder, and then it's going to pop back down whenever we come around. And that little pop down is enough to keep friction on this system from going backwards. Now, while loading through the gate is how you would put ammo in, getting it out is entirely different. For that, we have to pull back on this latch, which is a derivative in heavily modified form from the old Full and Weeks. So I'm gonna pull this guy back. And by the way, take note as we're doing this, there's a projection on this side of the gun that is not on the other side of the gun. This guy is a holster guide for the latch. It's to prevent the leather from dragging on this and therefore opening the gun up in your holster. Pretty smart. So with this separated, I will tip the barrel forward, and as I do so, our cylinder comes along as well. It's being held by a set of sort of pins. We'll see these in a minute. At the front, it's being dragged along. What is the ratchet teeth and the extractor star is not moving. It's being held to the rear, and that means it's going to separate our cases just until here, and then any unloaded cases will fall free and loaded cartridges should remain. We'll see that in better detail in just a second. If you snap that back closed, the only way to get a loaded cartridge out of this gun is, in theory, through this gate, but there is no ejector, which means you'd have to use the included tool if they didn't fall free on their own for any reason. So just to see that in action, I'm going to use a mix of dummy cartridges and spent cases because we want to see that selective extraction at work. So load this guy, load that guy, load this guy, make sure I'm getting these alternating because it makes my brain feel good. All right. And I'm getting a little drag because this has a burr right at the top of that. There we go. Recoil shield. There we go. All right, so we're loaded up. Now, if you want to unload the live cases, you would just have to rotate them into position, and then they should drop free. If they were sticking, you would use that tool like I just said. So, if we shot this gun, and weirdly, we managed to shoot it, oh boy. We're going to have to shoot every other round somehow, but I'm just doing a worst case scenario here. Normally, you'd have 3 empties and 3 lives if you had shot 3 rounds, but we'll see why this is actually potentially possible later on with this gun. So, what I would do is I'd go ahead and crack this guy open and spread the gun apart. But let me get you a better view before I do that. All right, good luck. Ooh. Okay. Yeah, I might not have been aggressive enough. And if you notice, the one in the 6 o'clock position, just like we said, is stuck. So you got to roll the cylinder to get that guy free. And then now my loaded... Oh boy, okay, nope. Come on, oh, genius system. Let's try that again. Now, I do recommend that this is done with some gusto and with the back of the gun lower than the front. So let's see what we get. Okay, one fell free for sure. If we flip her over, okay, we got another one out, but we've got a spent casing at 12 o'clock, there we go. So it took a little pitching around. Now, we had a live cartridge at the 6 o'clock position. If we didn't, you'd almost be guaranteed a jammed case there. You have to flip and roll the cylinder to get it out. Now, at this point, you can, in theory, just close the gun back up, and your 6 loaded rounds will be right where they should be. Although that always, for me, takes at least 2 jerks of the barrel to get it to happen. There's also, frankly, a potential for a very bad situation, which is if you get this guy open and you start shaking this around, especially with the barrel lower than the front of the gun, what you'll end up happening eventually is one of these cases, or one of these live cartridges rather, will get in front of the extractor star. And if you try to close it, it doesn't actually allow snap over, and you end up jammed. And you have to deform the brass and bang on the gun and cause a lot of damage in order to get her back closed, or you have to open her up, chase out that cartridge, which thankfully in this case is coming loose on its own, and get it back over the extractor star before you can close the action. Boy, that seems really lightning fast. Once again, woe betide anybody who thinks he can get one of these live cartridges, although again, these are dummies, but anybody who thinks he can get an actual cartridge out of the gun by taking it out through the extractor star. You must do this through the gate, which is just as slow and awkward as ever. Now, with the action closed, the whole thing is locked together at the top and at the bottom hinge, which is held by a singular screw. The arbor really isn't doing any work, but it is protected at both ends. As a matter of fact, I've pre-loosened this screw so that I can get in here, because I want to show you how that arbor is held at the front. So we'll get that screw out of there, we'll open up this barrel, we'll go ahead and pull the whole barrel assembly off the gun. More on that in just a second. But here is our cylinder, which is completely independent of our arbor here. So if we look, that guy is just sticking out in the wind. However, he's constantly shrouded by the cylinder, who's held in place by this stud. This guy is actually a ring that fits in with, oh boy, let me see if I can show you these guys. There's a pair of free rotating pins that are essentially riveted into place on this gun. As a matter of fact, these go missing fairly often, so if you see one for sale, pay very close attention, because I'm sure these are a little difficult to replace. But the one on either side, they hold that cylinder across that groove right there. So in theory, here, let me see if I can tip these guys up, because it's kind of a pain to use them for reassembly. You would drop that guy in there, and then that allows this to pivot however it needs to, or technically this guy's pivoting, and there's no problem with that, no added friction. So yeah, not too bad. Now, it's a bit hard to make out there, but I'm using a flashlight and acrylic bore scope in order to show you the rifling, which, yeah, that might be blowing out just a bit, but you guys get the idea. What we have in there is actually Henry rifling, same as the 450 Martini. It's a 7 groove, 1 turn and 22 inches, tapering slightly from breech to muzzle, 4.76 down to 450. So this is not, by the way, a 4.76 bore. More on that, of course, in the future. The Enfield Revolver was issued with an implement, pistol, revolver, breech-loading, Enfield pattern Mark I. This had 2 screwdriver heads, a simple wrench, and mainspring cramp. I don't have one of these. I just have this screwdriver, which will work in one of the 2 screws at the back of this gun, the one that we care about, which is the lower screw. The upper shouldn't really need to be played with unless you specifically want the wood separated from the metal. So let me not screw this up while trying to do it for the camera. And get this guy all that, good lord. They really don't want this coming loose for good reason, as we'll see in a moment. You know, it's so much better to do this up against my own lap instead of all the way forward for you guys. But with that screw loosened, the entire back plate of the gun comes off. And as you can tell, the frame is actually a fairly compact piece that can be milled out in a smaller format. And then we have our one-piece grip wrapped around a tang extension at the rear. Now, if you note, we now have our butt cap, lanyard ring, back strap, these 2 screws, and then a square tab for catching into the frame. All the metal that I just mentioned on the original version of this gun was supposed to be nickeled. However, they ran into some problems. As a matter of fact, the prototype had the entire back half of the revolver nickeled, but that was dropped because it had a tendency to flake into the action. I'm not sure what caused them to give up on this final bit of nickeling at the end, but supposedly a few examples did escape off to India that still had the nickeled grip. So if you happen to find one that is like, you know, early production with nickel backstrap and cap, but the rest of the gun is blued, that should actually be correct. So congratulations on your prize. Now to remove the side plate, well, we had to remove the grip because there's a tab here, and we have to remove this front screw, just the one. Don't be confused by anything else you see on the gun. And with that, we can just, oh boy. There are pry points built into the gun. There's one up front here that should fit your screwdriver. And then, actually I believe that's the only pry point. The rest of it, you're supposed to get a hold of this tab. Oh, good lord. These things are stiff. You know what? I'm gonna give it a little plastic whack off camera, 1 second. Okay, that worked pretty well. I know some of you, if these are really gunked up, you're gonna need to pry maybe between the hammer and things. When you do that, be exceptionally careful. I highly recommend getting a small shim and pushing in there, even like a feeler gauge from the auto store. Push in there and just move the grit around without distorting the metal. And sometimes you'll be able to bap it loose without actually prying where you're not supposed to pry on these guns, because you can do a lot of damage to these edges without really meaning to by putting even a couple of pounds of pressure there. So let's go ahead and get this off. And you'll note that our hammer pin is still where it's supposed to be. Some people get confused on that with these guns because there's that big screw there and it looks like you're supposed to immediately start cranking on that to take it apart. Don't bother unless you absolutely have to, because it's fit very strongly. And also, if you do have to remove this for damage of some sort, be aware that this is reverse threaded. It's righty-loosey. Please don't damage the gun worse. This is very common to see these slots distorted from people not understanding that. All right, let me get this back over to the other side though. Now, here is our lockwork, which is very clearly a modified Warnant because we have a complicated mainspring. The upper half of it is powering the hammer. The lower half is a overarching arm that comes up and in theory on the original Warnant would have powered the hand and trigger, but in this case, it's actually pushing on a sort of rotating transfer bar that then presses on the hand and therefore the trigger. Okay? At the bottom of this, very hard for us to see, there is a sort of shelf on the lower arm of the mainspring that presses against the bottom extension of the hammer, forcing a rebound. So, in other words, if I cock this back, we can see right there, this big extension at the bottom of the hammer is meeting a plate on that lower spring that's currently compressed. So if we let that fall forward, boom, The extension is back here. When we release, the spring will drop and it'll push the extension rearward. That's the rebounding element. That's really the core of the Warnant patent. Now, the rest of this, fairly straightforward, right? I pull trigger, trigger goes ahead and drives hand upwards. The hand has a hook underneath of it that actually pushes back on the hammer. That should seem very familiar to you guys who have seen our Swiss 1878 episode. Heck, while we have them both, let's put them together because they should look extremely similar now that you know how to interpret revolvers. Trigger with the odd extension, trigger with the odd extension. Hand, hand. The downside of the hand pushes back on the hammer. Hard to see, but we'll see in our animation. We have this arm that's reaching around and powering the hand and trigger and rebounding the hammer. Arm that's reaching around, added fifth element that is doing those things. Okay, there's one difference. However, it's almost like a mirror in terms of the parts count because what happened in Switzerland is they actually stole the Fanu style of having this separate arm with a simpler mainspring so that they didn't have to make the mainspring this complicated shape. Here, they kept the mainspring fairly complicated but got better leverage and slightly less work on the mainspring by adding this arm. So this guy's kind of equivalent to this guy from the Swiss, but otherwise generally the same lockwork with one kind of interesting exception that I haven't found anything written on. Being a Warnant lockwork, the entire design is meant to have one spring operate the entire lockwork, and yet we have a second one down in there, a coil spring that's fitted inside the trigger and riveted in place. I cannot find any mention of when this was added or specifically why, although I can pretty much guess. The two options are it's either supposed to push the trigger or it's supposed to push the hand, although I guess it could be both. I don't think it's meant to push the trigger because I had no problems with the Swiss trigger. There's no slack point in the design. Instead, I suspect that they must have had problems with getting enough force behind the hand to keep it from skipping. Maybe because of the weight of everything that was going into the ratchet system of this particular revolver. So right now it's doing nothing, but as we cock the gun, or if we pulled the trigger double action, right at the apex of the hand, it starts to put extra pressure on that hand, and therefore really drive it into the cylinder. That, I guess, was one big problem they had in testing, although again, I can't find any mention of it whatsoever, and yet there's a whole part there. More curiously, I've seen some very early drawings of this gun, and they really seem to ignore the fact that that spring is there. Not that it's not listed, but it's just not really accounted for. I don't know. It's very bizarre and something I'd like to learn more about when and how it happened in the system. All right, it's a bit crowded in there, so let's go ahead and get a closer look with one of Bruno's animations.
To start things off, we'll open up the loading gate and thumb in 6 rounds of Enfield Mark II, manually indexing the cylinder each time. Single action operation is straightforward. Manually cock back the hammer, and its forward projection snags on the rearward projection from the trigger. Pull said trigger, and the hammer is released to fall. Like most revolvers, this one has a standard hand, which is attached to the trigger. The hand is biased forwards by a sort of rotating mainspring extension, the controversial fifth part. This simply transfers pressure from the lower half of the mainspring into the hand. When the trigger is pulled, directly or by cocking the hammer, it raises the hand, which again is biased forward by the transfer bar from the mainspring, keeping the hand firmly against the cylinder's ratchet teeth. Note this additional coil spring. Fitted to the trigger, it keeps extra pressure on the hand, especially at its peak. Being a true Warnant action, the hand also serves as a strut between the trigger and the hammer. A right side projection from the bottom of the hand fits under the hammer's forward extension, so pulling the trigger raises the hand, which in turn tips the hammer back until the projection slips by and the hammer falls. On releasing the trigger, the pressure from the mainspring, which was transferred into the hand, is further transferred to the trigger, returning it forward as the hand is shoved back downwards. The trigger also features a projection at its top. This serves as a simple cylinder stop. Pulling the trigger causes it to rise and block the further rotation of the cylinder at the right moment to align the chamber and bore. Note the complex mainspring shape, which is designed to rebound the hammer. We simply fire the gun, And as we release the trigger, the lower mainspring will collide with an extension off the bottom of the hammer, causing it to tip back, thus pulling the firing pin from the chamber automatically. To eject our spent casings, we won't use the gate. Instead, we'll pull back on this latch, which releases the top strap, allowing us to break open the revolver. As we open the action, the extractor plate moves a short distance with the cylinder before being halted. The cylinder then continues on its own. It's being dragged by a set of rotating pins fitted to the barrel assembly. These drag the cylinder forward enough to free any spent casings, which either fall out or are shaken out or rotated out of action. I think that pretty much covers it. Let's get back to Matthias.
Now, before we get shooting, I do need to cover one detail on this particular gun. They were only temporarily issued with the 450 Adams cartridge. That's because the Mark I Enfield cartridge was experiencing some sort of problem. The only lot that is known to have shipped for usage in the field was sent to India very early on, and they remain almost undetected in the collector's market today. When the Mark II cartridge was approved on November 30th, it was explicitly noted that its casing was of solid drawn brass construction, which gives us a clue that the Mark I might have been a two-piece case. It's worth noting that this was a .455 diameter bullet meant to be fired in a bore that tapers down to .450. We'll talk next time about why so many people seem to think that the Enfield was a .476 gun. Heck, I've used .476 as shorthand because it's so accepted in the collector's market, but again, more on that next time. This is already a very long episode. And we haven't even had time to let May shoot the gun, so let's get on with that. That is a unique experience for sure. But let's talk production, because for the Mark I Enfield, it would be somewhat truncated. Manufacture would begin in 1880, and the production reports were recorded from April to March of each year. The first yielded a whopping 11,112 pistols. They had to make just that one extra. Excellent start, but Britain did have a world-spanning empire. The next year would only yield 1,307 pistols. That's quite the drop-off. It's estimated the production cost Enfield an average of £2, 19 shillings, and 7 pence per revolver. And if you're wondering about why they cut it so short the next year, well, Enfield's very first government-made revolver wasn't exactly perfect, and would fairly quickly require significant overhaul. We'll actually talk next time about why, and what emerges as the Mark II. But for now, there are more pressing matters, like, who gets paid for this thing? Well, we just covered the evolution. But who in the end was holding the paper? Well, Kaufman and Warnant held a British patent on the 5th component added to the Warnant lock. Small problem, it was determined that this was simply a derivation of the solution created by Mr. Perry at Enfield, and the law at the time said if one part of an invention was not novel, then the whole patent was void. Okay. Kaufman also now either owned or had stake in the original de Munsey patent of 1876, which was again supposedly registered for Jean Warnant. Now that should be good for something, especially because in a letter from November of 1880, Owen Jones advised the War Office that he would be handling Warnant's claim for remuneration. He now owned 1/4 of the de Munsey patent. Uh-oh. They were actually working together as well as their components in the revolver. Or maybe better than the components were working together, I guess. Frederick Close also backed Warnant's claim, another point in the originator's favor. In February of 1881, Jones asked if the government proposed to reward the inventor or the patent holders at all for their ideas in use. This was followed by demands from, well, actually a variety of seemingly unrelated people. Charles Price, Richard Redmond, Joseph Smith, and John Stanton. All of Birmingham, mind you, made claims to elements of the revolver, specifically the rebounding hammer. Stanton's was at least the most sensible claim of the lot, as he had patented a rebounding hammer as part of a side lock design way back in 1867. This was particularly applicable because the mainspring pushed both ways on the hammer. Now, in all of this, Warnant accused de Munsey of having stolen his work instead of just promoting it like he was supposed to. Jones apparently accused Kaufman of patenting the Warnant lockwork modification in the United States without permission, which actually kind of helps her claim that Jones was probably trying to produce this in America commercially. Also, Tranter showed up to lay claim to the 5th component as well. Now it's all working like the revolver here, sort of together. I know what you're thinking. All this arguing is pointless because the government will have to pay whoever is the actual patent holder of the inventions they use. But you'd actually be wrong in this case because at that time, British law was such that the Crown was not obligated to pay any holder of a British patent for use of his invention by servants of said Crown. However, awards were normal and expected when an invention found its way into service. So the squabbling was actually to be decided by the War Office Committee regardless of patent law. In November of 1881, they decided as follows. £1,500 in total would be paid out. $750 to Owen Jones for the extractor mechanism, $650 to the holders of the de Munsey patent for Warnant's lockwork, and supposedly £100 to the various claimants of rebounding hammers. However, I have seen other sources say that £200 were paid specifically to John Stanton, so I'm unsure which is true of these last bits of funding. Okay, with all that wrapped up, I'm going to call this one for today. We'll talk next time about the service life and problems with the Mark I Enfield before we explore the improved Mark II, the response to those problems. For now, though, let's just get May's opinion on this beast here. All right, once more, we've made room for May.
Hello.
And we have just enough room for this monstrosity of a wheel gun. Ooh, that's a big boy.
God, that's just overcomplicated looking.
Before you get into the ergonomics of it, I want to point out many years ago, when I was just a young lad who was getting into old guns and I started buying, Milserps.
He was fresh baby Othias.
Yeah, very little beard going on.
It's true. It was weird.
Yeah, thank you. I had a chin strap. Hey, you still hung out with me.
It was a chin no.
Anyway, I had a Webley Mark IV 38, right?
Oh,
and you'd find the Enfield No. 2 Mark Is and stuff like that laying around, right? Mm-hmm. I never saw one of these in person until I went to go cover this gun. Essentially, I started doing my actual research on it. So I'd see photos of them, though, on occasion.
Yeah. Would you think much of them?
Well, I thought they looked pretty cool.
Okay.
I did not understand the scale until I finally had one in front of me, and I went, oh, I don't know why I didn't realize this is going to be as big or bigger than a Mark VI 455 Webley.
Right, that it might potentially make your hand look small.
Right. I didn't I don't know why I didn't realize that, but I didn't. It makes sense.
Well, if you think about it, you hadn't really seen pictures of it with something to put it to scale.
Well, I'm just an idiot. It's British Revolver, this big, you know.
If someone had
38.
put a TI-83 calculator next to it, you'd have instantly known that scale.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. It's pretty big. Anyway, let me hand you that.
Thank you.
So let's get your first impressions on the ergonomics of this particular revolver, because you've handled a lot of guns from this era in the, I guess, the wheel gun category at this point now.
That's true. He's been forcing it upon me.
Oh, whatever. Think of the context. Has any show ever had this much context on revolvers before? Do you know how many articles are written every year about the Colt single-action army over and over and over again? And yet, how much stuff have you guys learned from this series that you've never even heard of before?
Yeah, you actually mentioned earlier there's no dedicated book to this. When you told me that, I was concerned because I know the research you go into just to find the books or the articles on these pieces and to find out there wasn't much out there. That's insane.
Oh yeah, we're driving our viewer numbers into the ground by exploring stuff they've never heard of. Because
C&Rsenal, our dedication is real.
Well, everybody wants to hear what they've already heard, but just a little bit better, right?
Yeah.
And we'll be doing that in 2023. We have to. We're going to go broke. But for me, I want to understand the things I don't understand. So this is a big one, right? No one had a book out on it.
Literally.
So anyway, back to the topic.
Yeah.
What's it like to actually hold it?
Well, if it makes his hand look small, can you imagine what this was going to do for me? I mean, I love the concept of it. I love the idea of this giant honkin' revolver and shooting black powder with the big plumes that come with it. The idea of it all in and of itself sounds really cool. And then I get in my hand and I go, oh, dang, this is way bigger than I anticipated. This looks like it's going to be a lot more difficult for me to handle with my smaller hand scale.
Yeah, speaking of hands, let's do our new experiment, right?
Our new experiment?
Yeah. Snap, just don't close your eyes. Don't close your eyes. That's what I'm saying. Grab this quickly, quickly as you can.
Okay.
And just point it at that camera. So the quick is, we're doing a quick draw.
Okay.
But I want to see where your hand goes naturally when you're in a hurry.
All right, ready?
Yeah. Okay, so you're up at the knuckle.
Yeah, I'm definitely up at the knuckle. So this camera right here, you
but
can
now
see.
try to grab the trigger.
Yeah.
Can you actually pull from that position?
I mean, maybe? It's not easy. It's
Right?
definitely not easy.
Do you think you could shoot accurately from that position?
No, definitely not, because I feel kind of torqued in some ways.
Right. So now take the position that you actually shot from.
So I actually ended up, so if anyone saw it, I would, for single action, I was all the way up, a little tucked up higher, but for double action, I did tuck further down to give myself a more linear reach with that.
Right.
And it feels weird because I'm not up where the knuckle's supposed to be, so it's a weird placement as is. There feels like there's a lot of room between my middle finger and this gap between the trigger and the grip, or the trigger, Guard. Thank you. I couldn't think of the word guard. I was blanking. And the grip itself. So there's a lot of room just everywhere on this grip for me to be. And unfortunately, where I need to be to get that trigger proper grip wise, it's kind of weird. It's awkward for me.
Now my hand's much larger.
Yeah. So do you need to try a quick draw?
If I get a full grip up on the knuckle and I point, my natural point is very high.
Yep.
And I can indeed pull through just fine. I actually don't have that hard of a time because I guess my hand is large enough to get what I need. Now I will say it's not a great gun for doing a fingertip. It's almost better to get like not the knuckle, but the armpit of that knuckle and fingertip in there.
Right.
And then I'm here and the double action's working. The problem is, if I'm using the knuckle, I really have to drive this forward. And once I drive it forward, I'm no longer using what I would call snap shooting. I'm not pointing my finger and it's shooting in that direction. So that means I have to rely on the sights. I hate to skip around a little bit, but could you describe those for us briefly?
Yeah, I can. And remind me of something when it comes to this grip, when it comes to shooting. There's a difference in the trigger pull, and I want to talk about that.
Sure.
So his job is to remind me. Let's see if he remembers.
Okay,
folks.
so we're just on presentation of grip.
Okay,
though.
so the sights themselves, honestly, they are so tiny in comparison to everything else going on behind this gun.
Have we ever seen
ridiculous.
a revolver this big with sights that small?
I don't think so. I can't think of...
You know what?
No.
Let's give it a challenge in editing. We can't remember them all while we're sitting here on stage, but we'll go through some of the big, like late 1870s,
see if I can find something. Maybe
early
the Gasser?
1880s.
No,
that was way bigger.
That was bigger.
Even the Reichs revolver was way bigger.
Montenegrin was bigger. Oh, I'm not going to remember off the top of my
We'll
head.
cycle through them. See if we'll make the challenge later in editing.
See if I
we
find
can
a winner.
one.
Yeah.
But I don't think so. I think this is actually most comparable to the pocket pistols that we saw.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that front. That's pretty weak for what it should be.
Yeah, it is a massive rear gutter and it is narrow. Anyway.
Otherwise, ergonomics wise, obviously there's a lot that isn't quite looking correct on this gun, because if I were to think of this as just in comparison to some other revolvers I've handled for the series, I'm thinking, what is going on here? Why is there a hinge point there when it looks like it's a gate loader? Like, my brain would take a second to realize, oh, it's also got this top break open action that is Galandish styled. That's weird, man.
Yeah, it's like a Webley and a Galand had a baby. Yeah. It's super bizarre. I love the triangle shape at the front, like this negative space of a triangle.
Oh, I know.
When you first see it, you go, why did they have to have that there? And then you open it up and you see how the cylinder fills it.
It's got to actually have the room to maneuver. Right. Sure, it makes sense. But when you're looking at it just now, you're thinking, oh, that can't possibly be a useful space. What the heck is going on?
It's just got this weird belly sticking out.
Yeah, no, absolutely bizarre. And speaking of which, it's kind of weird because normally whenever we go to load and unload a gun specifically, there's usually one way of doing it. It's either a gate loader or it's a top brake or, swing out cylinder. It's kind of weird that this is two things.
Right. You have to have two mechanisms in play.
I don't think we've handled one before that's actually had two methods of load, one separate method of load versus unload. And then it's weirder even because when the cartridges are loaded, when they're actually live rounds and you want to get them out, you have to unload them from the gate because you can't really get them out when you go to top break this open. I remember you talking about that in the episode. It's super weird.
Yeah, you don't really have an ejector for the gate position, but in theory, the cartridges should fall free.
Right.
But God help you if you let them get, I don't know, soaked in mud or something.
Oh, I know. Even on range with us having the pristine environments that we have, I still had to do some wiggle to get them out of there.
Yeah, it's a little wild. Mm-hmm. I wonder, well, we'll talk about it more next episode, actually. I don't want to get too far into it, but there is something that might make that even worse coming up.
Oh, God.
Yeah, no, I just realized it while we're talking.
What? I don't even know what he's talking about.
I don't even have a way to test it right now.
I'm not happy about this.
Anyway, the only thing I can think of that might be comparable is you do open the gate on the French 1892 swing out cylinder. Yeah. And in theory, you could kind of use it like a gate loader, but you don't. You just go ahead and use it. Mm-hmm. But yeah, this is the first time I've ever seen sort of a hybrid system in the sense that you literally have two methods of operation for loading versus extraction. And then even then, weird. It's two methods of extraction depending on whether it's a cartridge or an empty case, which is a lot of math. Right.
There's a lot of extra thinking that has to go into that. I don't think the average soldier would appreciate that.
Yeah, it frankly throws me off, and I understand the gun, and I still do all sorts of goofy stuff with it, trying to handle it, where I always try to get, I don't know about you, I kept trying to get live, well, not live, there are dummies that emulate live cartridges, but I kept trying to get live cartridges out of it through the extraction, because I'd sit there and I'd extract them all, spin them out, close it up, go, oh, I got to get these out of here, and then I just open it back up like a dingus.
Oh, yeah, 100%, because that's the method to unload. That's what you know is the method to unload, and even here, we have to go, oh, shoot, okay, now I've got to do the gate and do this weird little dance with it.
Yeah. Anyway, how is opening that? Can you do it from the static position? So if you're gripping the gun.
So if I'm just gripping the gun, you're asking if I'm just able to that's pretty, that's a pretty positive. But the thing is, definitely, you want to make sure you get gravity to give you a little bit of a hand with that. I actually weirdly found when I was opening it, so I would open it a little bit tilted, but I made sure I had a good snap to it when I opened it all the way. Otherwise, I was finding the rounds were just sticking way too much.
It's a little awkward to film it vertically because we get the silhouette effect.
Yes.
So we kind of film it down by her waist, but to be honest with you, I would almost exclusively use that gun vertically because the rims can get in front of the extractor star, and it's a huge mess.
Oh, yeah, we've had that happen before. And then you always have problems with, obviously, whatever round is underneath at the 6 o'clock position. That one's always going to give you problems.
Yeah, real pain. So, okay, we're a little bit all over the place. You did say you want to talk something about the trigger?
Yeah, I did want to mention, so we were talking earlier about the grip and how when we were pulling the trigger through different positions on that, right? There was something I kind of noticed just now on camera that we didn't really play with it on range, so it literally just occurred to me just now.
Okay.
Whenever I go to pull the trigger right now, it doesn't feel as heavy. It doesn't feel like I'm having to pull through quite as much force, and it's not changing. I think this feels a little bit different when it's loaded.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I think I have one. I should have one of our empty cases still.
Right.
Let me borrow that gun for a second.
Either I'm thinking because of the extra little bit of rim maybe sticking out, or maybe there might be some setback happening whenever you recoil. Maybe it's pushing back against the face. No, I suspect it's the
design of the breech face. I haven't gotten out the calipers to measure. I'm not even sure how I would without making a whole I think I could do it with a cross slide and a feeler gauge, but that's a lot of investment in time in order to just go with, I think, therefore it might be. If I start rotating this, you can see it's nice and smooth until I get to the 12 o'clock position. That's when it starts tying up. If you load all 6 cartridges, you almost always have something crossing the 12 o'clock position. And what I suspect is going on here is that we're using reloads that are not quite the correct rim thickness for this gun.
Okay.
And I suspect what's happened is a lot of these older revolvers, well, I don't know if they're still doing it or not, but definitely in the older ones, they had a system by which they could sort of guarantee less drag overall by having the actual breech face, the part that is in contact with the base of the case when you're firing, just a little bit proud.
Okay.
So what's happening is it's probably the breech face is thickest or the most forward.
Okay.
Right at the 12 o'clock position. That way, once you fire it and you roll it over, it's not dragging at all the other positions.
Right.
However, in doing that, and by having a slightly thicker rim on our admittedly hand loads, we're probably squeezing at that last bit. So we might be giving this gun an unfair reputation by saying it was getting a little bit of drag, because fully loaded, you would have...
Okay, so that actually does make sense for what happened on range for me then. Well, let me go into a little bit more while it's dry right now, just to kind of give you guys more of a description. So unloaded, long trigger pull, but it definitely feels very even, which is kind of nice. And then the break, I can't really tell the break is about to happen for the double action pull. That's pretty good. Although that was this just now, that Jonas, did y'all see that snag? Hold on. Right there. So,
on the release? Yeah,
on the release. I noticed that on range too, that I accidentally did not, one of the rounds, I didn't release it all the way forward, and I went to go pull through again. I went, oh, nope, I needed to make sure I let that trigger reset. So I noticed the reset on this one in particular is a little bit
Can you force
snaggy.
Actually, I haven't tried on this gun. I wonder if I can force a cylinder rotation without engaging the hammer. Is that possible?
It doesn't look like it's doing, it looks like all it's doing is just pushing the cylinder forward.
No, okay. It skips really hard forward at the last bit.
But you feel that snag too. It's very prominent on this example.
Yeah, I think it's when the rebound's catching, by the way. No, okay, you cannot force a rotation of the cylinder without the hammer engaging. That's really good, actually.
That really is.
Because the last thing you want in combat is to be going, boom, boom, and do a partial release, have it spin the cylinder, not go boom.
Right.
Have to release again, especially if it's your 6th round, find it again,
Right, no, that would be a pain in the butt. But that was something I did notice, and I want to make sure I pointed it out.
That's something Tranters can do.
And then the single action pull, when it's empty, oh my God, that's so much different. Guys, that's actually night and day pretty different. It's a little bit sad because I wish we had the most pristine rounds to shoot out of this, because then I know on range I remember thinking, God, this trigger is insanely heavy. It's actually difficult to operate not just in single action but in double action too, of course.
To be fair though, there's going to be elements that get into the gun. There's going to be, as much as we might have been squeezing the rims a little bit, this gun was perfectly lubricated. It hadn't been sitting in a holster. So some of that drag potential is going to be there no matter what. Yeah. And also, I'd have to check our measurements, but I doubt we were that far off on the case rims.
Oh, yeah.
So I think it might actually have a bit of drag in the system.
That's fair.
So the hammer itself, though.
Yeah, no, I was actually wanting to make sure I talked about that. This is a really awkward point of rotation on this hammer. Look at its location. It's actually slightly forward of, even if my fingers are up against the guard, it's slightly forward of where my fingers rest against the guard.
Oh, yeah, but the knuckle does a really good job of
getting in your
shrouding you from reaching the
hammer.
Oh,
yeah, I am super behind this knuckle, so you have to reach up and grab it, and it is a heavy hammer to pull back. It's an awkward point of rotation. Combined with those two things, it was not one I was able to operate, unfortunately, without getting some assistance from my other hand.
I tried describing this earlier.
Can you try it?
Yeah, sure. I just tried describing this earlier, and it's something that...
You probably can reach.
It's very difficult to understand without putting your hands on it. I can see it visually not making sense to anybody at home, but I have to come over to the side. There's no way to cross the knuckle because the knuckle is very specifically in your way. I have to come over to the side and cock back. And that's not too terrible, except I will say it has this massive hammer spur, but it's actually convex. It's not concave, which is weird. Then, even though it's wide, it's not very long. And as a matter of fact, there's still plenty of room to have it be longer.
Right. They could have done it, but they just didn't. And then why convex and not concave? I thought about that too. It's really bizarre.
The thickness of the hammer itself is insane. So you kind of think because it's so far away from the firing pin, you think, I'm way over center, this should help. But not really, because the trunk of it's really close to the back. So it feels like you're really not getting very much mechanical advantage at all.
Right.
You're doing a lot of pulling back, more so than you are pulling down. On a good hammer, you have it far enough back that you're really just pulling down and it's going over center, right? On this hammer, you're kind of having to drag it with friction backwards as you rotate.
Yep.
And it makes it extremely difficult to do. It's frankly probably the worst revolver hammer I have felt in terms of how much extra poundage I have to put into it in order to use it normally.
I think it's just the worst design hammer.
I actually just popped my knuckle on my thumb playing.
Oh, no. Oh, no. We broke Othis.
Anyway, I'll feel that tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely not my favorite. Honestly, I love that you mentioned that convex part, because that totally is a thing on here. I didn't even notice it. That curve right there, that belt up to it.
It's proud.
It's really bizarre. Don't care for it whatsoever. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, aside from
there's
the recoil.
There's a lot going on visually, but I guess there's not that much to describe, is there?
No, there's really not. I mean, I can talk about things like with the recoil and how, there's actually, a moderate amount of recoil with it. Giant black powder plume, flames everywhere, which was really freaking cool.
Did it beat your hand up at all?
No, I think honestly having to work the trigger in the action worked up my hand more than the actual impact that this gun had on my hand from the recoil.
Despite all the problems, the actual shot on this, really satisfying. It makes a terrific noise.
It's a good thoom, like a deep black powder sound with it.
The recoil's fairly mild because it's so dang heavy.
Well, it was kind of more moderate, I think I want to say.
Really?
It was more moderate to mild.
Maybe, your hand's small, you didn't have the knuckle.
Oh,
because I tried it myself, and because I have the hand shape for it, I found it to be inaccurate. I was having trouble with getting on. I was on target, but just looser than I want to be. I felt like I was fighting the front sight.
I was definitely there with that.
But in terms of operation, it wasn't too terrible on trigger, despite being heavy. And then, especially because in my mind, I'm now aligned to 1880, right?
Yeah.
I'm not comparing it to an 1890s or 1900s.
Oh no.
So I'm pulling the trigger and I'm going, oh, this is real heavy. I'm real heavy, and that boom. Especially coming, I think, from the Tranters and things where the grips were kind of just off ergonomically for me. And also having shot like a Mark 6 Webley in 4.55.
Sure.
I actually found this to be fairly pleasant on the recoil, but not much else.
Nah, pretty much everything else, it kind of doesn't really work for you. You work for it.
Well,
I think that's weirdly everything. I can't really think of anything we may have possibly left out with this one.
No, there are some problems with this one, though, that would be accounted for in an updated model. And this has been a very long episode, so frankly, before we kick this one around or even talk about whether or not we would use it in combat like we normally do, I think we should probably cut this episode off.
Fair.
I know you guys are impatient sometimes, but the next one's not going to be nearly as long, but it's going to cover some critical details about the replacement piece.
Yep, we talk about the service of the pieces as well.
Yeah, so I think let's hear about this before we get May's final assessment on the Enfield, because I don't want to give too much away.
That's fair.
But any final thoughts on this one, just as it is right here today?
I was very interested in trying these out ever since you first showed me a picture of one online, simply because it was one of those guns that you mentioned how you couldn't really tell the scale of it. I too was having trouble, but it struck me that it must have been an insanely large revolver. And then we got it in and I realized, oh no, this was insanely large. And not only that, the lines on it are absolutely gorgeous. This was a unique experience to have. We haven't really had one that had the ejector Galan system, so I was kind of curious to try that out to see how it worked out.
Right.
And then to find out it worked out terribly is just hilarious. That was the best part.
I wonder how the actual Galan does. We need to make ammo.
I don't know. Yeah, I want to try that one out because ever since you've had that one in for years, and we haven't been able to actually shoot it yet.
But look how wide that's opening up. That's got to be better, right? Like, because this ejects this ejects everything.
Maybe. Although at least you don't got to worry about the rim getting caught awkwardly underneath the... What do you call it? The spur lips or something?
Yeah, in this case, it's just like an ejection. Normally they call them a star, although in this case it's more of a ring. But I'd still just say the ejector star. I don't know. This takes actually a lot of work to make the cartridges for, but we're going to try it one of these days.
Yeah. So, yeah, very happy to try that out for a change, and sad it didn't work. I
love this because this thing, it kind of reminds me of? You remember the Simpsons episode with the Homer where he designed, like, the best car?
No, I didn't watch a lot of The Simpsons.
I'm sorry. Well, it was a failed car design because it had too much of everything. That often at cross purposes, right?
Sure.
So I love this because you can tell they're going, okay, they really want gate loading, like solid frame, whatever, so we'll give them that. But they also want rapid extraction, so we'll give them that. But then you don't want to have to extract all the cartridges because the loaded ones are still good, so we'll make a selective extraction process. And then we need to make sure that it won't tear up the holster, so we're going to put these things in front of the cylinder to keep the holster from wearing in there. That's a good plus. That actually stuck around. But then we want to make sure that we can get this thing into a certain kind of milling machine. So we're actually going to make a separate piece on the grip. And then honestly, the parts that's hanging out of the holster rusts the most. So we're going to nickel that. Oh, that didn't work out. Okay, we'll get rid of the nickeling. Okay, so then we're going to have the simplest possible lock work, except for that was causing some weird drag. So we're going to add another piece to make that better. And then apparently it wasn't working against the star. So we'll add another spring. But it's okay. It's still the simplest. You see where it starts to get like...
Yeah, it's if you give a mouse a cookie kind of cascade. It
is absolutely every engineering advancement that they could get a hold of stuffed into one gun. And then the end result is not what I would call the most advanced, on paper, most advanced pistol of its day. On paper.
Yeah.
All right, we'll talk more about that next time, though.
Bye, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the episode.
Have a good one. Oh, it's just a lot of people don't realize that I was very social. Like, because they see old gunman who's very spurgy about stuff, and they think, well, that can't be.
Oh no, he's like the biggest social butterfly I've ever met. Especially whenever you get him around a bunch of boys, they all just start geeking out about stuff, and you'll be like, guys, let's go keep having this conversation. Let's go out to eat. Let's go get food and go hang out. Oh, there's an ice cream parlor there. Oh, look, it's like based on the 1950s. Let's go over there and do that. Like, you'll just talk everyone into going to do a bunch of shit. And before you blink, before you even freaking realize it, it's been 4 hours and you feel as if you just stroked out for a moment. Wait, what just happened? We just had a bunch of time together. How did this happen?
I hate politics in museums and I hate politics in archives, because this is why we know so little about the Ottoman Empire.
Yes.
Because as far as I understand it, Turkish museum positions, like a curator in Turkey, are often semi-political. And that whole region has gotten so nuts that like written Ottoman language from the empire from 1914, 1918, you're not... They're talking about now it's been 100 years. Their reforms and their sort of politicization of that stuff is so bad. Most people can't read it. It's like a normal American trying to read literal Old English because they're going, what does this say?
I still argue even the social media posts that I've been upping lately are still less slapped together than what most people are putting out there.
Oh, well, there's that. Most people just put out pictures of themselves.
Right. I don't think I've actually I haven't uploaded a single picture of myself. I've only been uploading, because I'm the one taking the pictures, so I'm uploading pictures of everybody else. Should I be taking pictures of myself? Is that a thing?
That's what the girls do.
Oh, crap. Oh, guys, I'm sorry, I girled wrong.
This fits perfectly in frame because it is a short magazine Lee Enfield Mark I. Star. Pay attention to this guy who is mounted on the bolt head and this little thick wall of the receiver, which is a dead giveaway